Snow swept across the open prairie like a restless spirit, the kind that whispered through the cottonwoods and left the land pale and breathless. The rancher had seen winters before, but never one this cruel. The wind howled against the wooden walls of his cabin, rattling the loose shutters and filling the cracks with a cold that seemed to cut through skin and bone. He sat near the fire, mending a torn saddle strap, his rough hands moving with the same patience he had learned from the years of solitude. Life on the frontier was not for the weak, it was a test of will, and lately, he had begun to wonder how much longer he could hold out. The silence outside was thick, broken only by the groan of trees and the distant cry of a coyote. He had planned to ride out earlier that day to check on the cattle, but the storm had rolled in fast, turning the land into a white blur. There was nothing to do but wait. Yet deep in that silence something stirred, a sound faint and uncertain like the soft cry of an animal in pain. He lifted his head, listening. The wind carried it again, a fragile voice tangled with snow and distance. He frowned, set the strap aside, and reached for his coat. When he stepped outside, the cold slapped him hard, burning his face and biting through his gloves. He scanned the snowfield beyond his porch, but all he saw was a shifting wall of white. Still, that sound came again, a broken call, weak but human. He pulled his hat lower and started walking toward it, boots sinking deep into the drift. The storm fought him every step, but his instincts wouldn't let him turn back. People didn't last long out here if they were caught in weather like this. A few yards down the ridge, he saw something half buried near a fence post. At first he thought it was just a fallen branch, but as he drew closer, the shape took form. A woman, motionless, her long dark hair tangled with snow. Her skin was ashen, her hands blue from the cold. She wore what looked like pieces of tattered buckskin, and a faded blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He knelt beside her and brushed the snow from her face. Her lips trembled, trying to form words that barely made a sound. He leaned closer and heard her whisper, "I got frostbite. I need to warm up." The voice was cracked and foreign, the accent unmistakable. Apache. He froze for a heartbeat. He'd heard stories of Apache raiders moving through these parts, and not all of them ended kindly. Yet there was no sign of threat in her eyes, only pain and exhaustion. She was barely conscious, her breath shallow. Whatever fear he might have had vanished under the weight of her condition. Without another thought, he lifted her into his arms and carried her through the snow, his boots crunching heavily as he made his way back to the cabin. Inside, he laid her down near the fire. She shivered violently, her body fighting the cold. He threw another log into the flames and fetched an old blanket from his cot. Her fingers were stiff, her feet nearly white. He hesitated for a moment, unsure how to help, then poured a bit of warm water into a tin bowl and soaked a cloth. He pressed it gently to her skin, hoping the slow heat would draw life back into her. She tried to speak again, but her words broke apart. He didn't understand all of it, something about the mountains, the snow, and a lost group. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for something familiar, but this was a rancher's cabin, not a place of comfort for someone like her. The distance between their worlds was wide, and yet fate had brought her to his doorstep. Hours passed as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside. Slowly, color began to return to her face. She looked at him with wary eyes, half afraid, half trusting. He saw the marks of hardship carved deep into her features, the same kind of wear that came from years of struggle. She wasn't young like the women who worked in town. There was a strength about her, quiet but fierce, like someone who had survived far too much. "You should rest," he said quietly, though he doubted she understood. She stared at him for a long moment before nodding slightly. When he offered her a cup of warm broth, her hands trembled as she took it. For a while neither spoke. The only sound was the wind scraping against the windows. Later, when he thought she had fallen asleep, he sat by the fire again, turning over the questions that wouldn't leave his mind. What was an Apache woman doing alone in this weather? Why had she come this far north? He had seen patrols not long ago, soldiers rounding up anyone from her tribe who strayed too close to the settlements. Maybe she had escaped. Maybe she had been left behind. Whatever the reason, she was in his care now, and he couldn't just turn her out. At some point, she stirred again and whispered something he couldn't quite catch. He leaned closer. "What did you say?" Her eyes opened, faintly reflecting the firelight. "Men came," she said slowly, her voice shaking. "They took everything." He waited for her to continue, but her strength faded, and she turned her face toward the fire. He knew that tone well, the kind that came from losing too much, the kind that didn't need more words. By dawn, the storm had eased, and a pale light crept over the horizon. The land looked quiet, almost peaceful, but he knew how quickly that could change. The woman was still weak but alive. He wrapped her in another blanket and stepped outside to fetch wood. As he did, he noticed something unusual in the snow, a set of tracks, faint but fresh, leading down from the ridge. They weren't his. He followed them a short distance, crouching to study the prints. Boots, not moccasins. 3, maybe 4 men, and they had passed not long ago. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If they were looking for her, trouble wasn't far behind. When he returned, she was sitting upright, watching him carefully. Her eyes went to the rifle hanging above the mantel, then back to him. There was fear there, but also understanding. She pointed toward the door, murmuring a single word in broken English. Pursued. He knew then that she wasn't safe here, and by taking her in, neither was he. Still, something inside him refused to hand her over. Maybe it was because he'd spent too many years alone, or maybe because she had clung to life when most would have given up. Either way, he couldn't let her go. "Who's after you?" he asked. She shook her head, closing her eyes as if even remembering was painful. He felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. The world outside was harsh, but it was men, greedy, cruel men that made it truly dangerous. As the day went on, he fixed her a small meal and tried to keep her comfortable. She was quiet, often staring at the fire like it held the ghosts of her past. Once, he caught her whispering something in her native tongue, the words soft and sorrowful. He didn't interrupt. By afternoon, the wind had stilled completely, leaving the world frozen in silence. The peace was uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the ranch from the tree line. Every creak of the wood and rustle of snow set his nerves on edge. He kept his rifle close and his eyes on the window. When he looked back at her, she was standing by the hearth, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. "They come," she said in a trembling voice. He stared at her, startled. "Who?" Her gaze shifted toward the door. "Men who burn." He moved to the window, heart pounding. Far off through the pale light, dark figures moved against the snow, their shapes growing larger as they approached. He turned to her, and for the first time, she looked him straight in the eye, her fear gone, replaced by quiet resolve. The rancher knew then that whatever story had brought her here was far from over, and by taking her in, he had just stepped into it himself. The wind carried the scent of smoke long before the rancher saw the men. He stood by the window, his hand resting on the cold frame, eyes fixed on the figures moving slowly through the snow. They weren't rushing, which made it worse. Men who weren't afraid to take their time meant trouble. He could tell from their posture, broad coats, rifles slung low, the kind of walk that came from years of violence. Outlaws most likely, or worse, bounty hunters. He turned to the Apache woman still wrapped in the wool blanket by the fire. She looked pale, but the alertness in her eyes told him she had strength left. She seemed to understand what was happening without him saying a word. Her fingers clutched the blanket tighter as if ready to run, even though she could barely stand. "They're coming," he said quietly. She nodded once, no panic in her face, only the kind of calm born from long suffering. Her people had lived through worse than this. He grabbed his rifle from the mantel and checked the chamber. The sound of the click filled the cabin, sharp and sure. Outside, the horses' hooves crunched through the frozen ground. He could see them clearer now, 3 men, maybe 4. Their coats were stained, their faces half covered in scarves. The lead rider had a long scar running across his cheek, visible even from a distance. The rancher had seen his type before. Hired guns, moving across the frontier like wolves, chasing whatever bounties or grudges paid best. The woman's voice came softly behind him. "They burned my camp," she said, each word slow and heavy. "They took the others." He turned. "Your family?" She shook her head. "My people, traitors. We moved toward the hills, away from soldiers. They found us first." Her eyes darkened. "They had blue coats once, then they took them off. Said no one would know who they were." That made him pause. Soldiers gone rogue. He'd heard of such men. Deserters who left the army with their weapons, living by robbery and violence across the unguarded lands. The law was too far away out here, and justice came only by a man's own hand. He thought about sending her away, telling her to hide somewhere in the hills until the danger passed. But one look at her frostbitten hands ended that thought. She wouldn't make it an hour in this cold. "Stay inside," he said. "No matter what happens." He stepped out onto the porch as the riders came closer. Their eyes followed him, weighing whether he was worth the trouble. The scar-faced man dismounted first, boots sinking deep into the snow. "Afternoon," he said with a drawl that carried no friendliness. "Cold out." The rancher didn't answer. The man's eyes flicked toward the cabin door, then back at him. "We're tracking someone," the rider said. "Indian woman. Might have come this way. You seen anything?" The rancher's jaw tightened. "Just snow and wind," he replied. "No one else around," the man smiled faintly. "Funny thing that. We found tracks not far from your fence line. Barefoot prints, small ones." He tilted his head. "You sure you haven't seen her?" The rancher said nothing. The silence between them stretched long enough for the wind to whistle through. Finally, the man nodded. "You're a quiet one. I respect that. But if you're lying, it won't end well. She's dangerous, that woman. Took something from us." The rancher's eyes narrowed. "Ain't much a frozen woman could steal." The rider's grin faded. "You'd be surprised." They stood there a long moment, measuring each other until the men finally turned their horses around and rode off toward the creek. The rancher waited until their silhouettes disappeared behind the ridge before he exhaled. When he went back inside, the woman was sitting rigid by the fire, her eyes fixed on the door. "They won't stop," she said. "They killed my brother. He tried to fight." He sat across from her. "Why are they after you?" She hesitated, staring into the flames as if searching for words. "They wanted gold. Said my people were hiding it. We had none. They killed our horses, burned our wagons. I ran. I thought I could reach the river, but the storm came." Her voice faltered. "They laughed when I fell." The rancher felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen cruelty before. Men taking what they wanted because no one could stop them. But the calm in her voice made it worse. She wasn't trying to gain pity. She was simply telling the truth, as one survivor to another. He poured her another cup of broth and pushed it toward her. "You'll stay here until you can walk again," he said. She met his eyes, hesitant. "Why help me?" He shrugged. "Because someone ought to." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a strange stillness behind. The world was covered in white, untouched and silent. But that peace was only skin deep. He knew those men would come back once they regrouped or realized she was still breathing. That night, sleep came light and uneasy. He sat near the fire with his rifle propped against the wall, listening to the faint crackle of the logs. The woman slept fitfully, murmuring in her own language, fragments of memories spilling into the dark. Once she cried out, and he turned to see her clutching her blanket, eyes wide in fear. He spoke gently. "You're safe here." Her breathing steadied after a while, but he could tell her dreams were haunted. He wondered what kind of life she had known before the war, before soldiers and greed tore through the lands her people once called home. In the morning, she was awake before him, sitting quietly near the door. She had found a piece of twine and was weaving something small. A simple bracelet, the kind made by hand to pass the time or ward off bad spirits. When she noticed him watching, she said, "For luck." He smiled faintly. "We could use some." He spent the day repairing the barn roof, keeping an eye on the hills. Every so often he saw movement in the distance. Maybe wind, maybe more. The cattle were restless too, as if sensing what was coming. The woman helped where she could, feeding the fire, fetching water from the barrel. Though she said little, her presence filled the cabin in a quiet way. By dusk, the unease returned. The horses snorted and stamped, their breath rising in white plumes. He went outside to check the gate and saw it again, hoof prints fresh and deep circling the property. They were watching, waiting for dark. Inside, the woman stood by the window, her hands trembling. "They will not stop," she whispered. "They want what I carry," he turned sharply. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then reached beneath her blanket and drew out a small leather pouch tied with sinew. She placed it on the table, and when he opened it, he found a single gold coin, tarnished but real. "My brother found it near the river," she said. "They saw it. Thought we had more. We did not." He closed the pouch and handed it back. "One coin's not worth a life." Her eyes met his, steady and full of something deeper. "To them it is." The wind began to rise again, low and eerie, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves echoing from the ridge. The rancher checked the rifle and blew out the lantern. The fire dimmed, leaving only the glow of embers. He looked at her, seeing the fear she tried to hide, and said, "Whatever happens, stay low." "Don't open that door?" She nodded, her fingers clutching the small bracelet she had woven. Outside, the night deepened, swallowing the last traces of twilight. The snow fell once more, quiet but relentless, covering the land and their tracks alike. He listened to the wind and the faint crunch of boots in the distance, his hand resting on the rifle. Somewhere out there, the men were closing in again. And though he didn't know why he felt it so strongly, he understood that this night would change everything for both of them. The land had a way of testing a man's heart, and soon he would find out just how much warmth was left in his own. The cold settled heavy that night, a weight that pressed on the roof and worked into the joints of the cabin. The rancher sat in the dark, counting the slow breaths that rose from the Apache woman on the pallet near the hearth. He had banked the fire low so the glow would not spill through the seams of the shutters. Outside, the wind stirred in fits, as if the land itself was holding back its voice. Now and then he caught the soft knock of ice on the window. He waited for other sounds. He waited for men. Near midnight, the horses in the corral tossed their heads. A bit rang against a post. He stood with the rifle and felt the boards under his boots give a quiet complaint. The woman's eyes opened. No fear screamed in them now, just a steady watchfulness that he had seen in riders facing a river in flood. He raised a hand to steady her. She nodded and drew the blanket around her shoulders, pulling it close under her chin so her frostbitten fingers would stay warm. Footsteps crunched in the yard, careful steps that tried to be light. The rancher moved to the back wall where the shadows were deeper. Through a narrow gap in the shutter, he saw the shape of a man crouched near the corral gate. Another figure slipped to the side of the barn. The scar-faced rider stood farther back, a darker blot against the snow. They were patient. They had done this before. He felt his jaw set and a line of heat run along his spine. He did not fire. Not yet. One shot would bring them in close. A man can fire quickly, but he cannot be in two places at once. Instead, he reached for the old cowbell he had hung behind the door and swung it once. The sound was dull, strange in the winter air. The horses shifted but did not bolt. The men paused. In that pause, the rancher stepped to the opposite window, cracked it a finger's width, and tossed a chunk of frozen wood across the yard. It struck the rail and skittered. One of the men swung his gun toward the sound. The rancher marked how they moved. The one at the barn lifted his head and showed that he had no patience. The scar-faced rider did not move at all. He was the one to watch. The men did not charge. They circled and then pulled away, vanishing into the line of cottonwoods beyond the creek. The rancher knew what that meant. They had taken the measure of the place and would return when the light favored them. He checked the woman. Her lips were pale but set. She whispered a few words he did not know and then said in rough English, "They wait for day." "They do," he said. "So we will get ready." At first light, he saddled his bay and led a spare horse by the bridle. The woman pulled the blanket tighter around her and tried to stand. He shook his head. "Inside for now. Eat. You will need strength." He set a tin of porridge by the fire and pulled on his gloves. "I am going to the line shack near the ridge. There is a stove there and old tools. If they push from the trees, the ridge will be our eyes." She looked at him a long moment. "You come back? I will." He rode out low and quick along the creek bed where the bank sheltered him from the cottonwoods. The sky was a hard blue that promised nothing. The snow squeaked under the horse's weight, that winter sound that carries far. Twice he stopped and listened. Twice he saw nothing but the pale sweep of land. At the line shack he found what he needed: a rusted trap, a length of wire, 2 lanterns that still held a finger of oil, and a coil of baling twine. He bundled it all in a grain sack and lashed it to the spare saddle. Then he looked toward the east, where the trail to town ran like a scar across the white flats. He considered the distance. A ride to town would take hours in this cold. The sheriff might be there, or he might be 2 counties away chasing a horse thief. There was also the storekeeper, who had a habit of hearing things and selling what he heard for profit. If the men hunting the Apache woman had friends in town, they would be watching that road. The rancher weighed all of it and turned the horses back toward the cabin. As he rode, he thought of another winter, a long time ago, when he had worn a blue coat and taken orders in a voice that did not know his name. Snow had fallen then too, and men had gone to ground under cottonwoods and never risen. He remembered a farm family that had given him bread and a night by the hearth, and how he had ridden away before dawn carrying a guilt he could not put down. The father had said that helping a stranger is like throwing a rope into a swollen river. Maybe it pulls you in, maybe it pulls them out. You do it anyway, because that is how a man keeps his hands clean in a dirty world. The memory walked with him all the way home. He saw the tracks at the fence line before he saw the cabin. 2 riders had come in close after he left, then pulled back again. They were marking his times, learning his habits. He led the horses to the shed, laid hay in a quick scatter to muffle hooves, and stepped inside the cabin. The woman had eaten and had tidied the place in small, careful ways, as if she needed order to steady herself. She had hung the wet cloth near the fire and swept snowmelt from the boards with a willow switch. She handed him the bracelet she had finished in the night. "For luck," she said. He slid it into his pocket. "We will take any we can get." The day wore on with the slow scratch of winter hours. He strung wire across the back path where the drift hid the posts. He set the rusted trap under loose straw near the barn corner, not to maim a man but to sound a shout of iron if it bit. He cut a peephole in the rear shutter and marked 2 trees with cord so he could judge distance at a glance. He filled the lanterns and set one on the floor by the bed, not lit, a promise for later when darkness would come fast. The woman watched and then began to prepare in her own way. She wrapped strips of cloth around her swollen feet, so the boots he found would not rub them raw. She checked the water barrel and brought in snow to melt. She tore a spare shirt into bandages and folded each piece with tidy care. When he saw her do that, he understood she had not only seen hurt but knew how to meet it. Near noon, the cows bawled from the far pasture. He grabbed the field glasses and climbed to the loft. Through the lens, he saw 2 specks on the ridge. They were not deer. They were men watching. He also saw a 3rd speck near the old cottonwood where the creek bent. That one he did not expect. It was smaller, perhaps a boy or a rider on a mule. The speck moved different. It did not belong to the scar-faced rider's circle. He saddled quick and rode alone to meet the stranger before the outlaws did. The stranger turned out to be an old freighter with a canvas coat patched more times than a scarecrow. He was leading a mule hitched to a sled of firewood. His eyebrows were white and thick as frost. "You pick a cold day for charity," the rancher said. The freighter grinned. "I sell this wood. Charity is for Sundays." He eyed the rancher and lowered his voice. "Heard talk in town. Men asking about a red blanket and an Indian woman who wears it." The storekeeper did most of the talking. Said there was a reward from a mining man who lost a shipment. Sheriff did not like the talk, but he could not stop it. "I thought you should know. You thought right. Do not come close to my place today. I can guess why." The old man's grin went away. "You want me to pull that talk a different direction? If you can. I can say I sold wood to the south line of the Hargrove place. The storekeeper will pass that like a cough in winter." The freighter nodded at the ridge. "You watch your back. There are men who like to step on a rattler just to feel brave. Thank you. Price for the warning is this." The old man reached into the sled and handed over a coil of rawhide and a tin of goose grease. For hands and feet that forgot what warmth is. The rancher took both. Fair price. They parted there, each vanishing into the white. The rancher hurried home with the news like a live coal in his pocket. He told the woman about the talk of a reward and a mining man. She listened with a flat look that said she had expected as much. "The coin," she said, tapping the pouch. Their eyes stuck to it. "Greed makes men blind. Blind men swing wide," he said. "They hit what is not meant to be hit." She nodded, understanding. "We must move. Soon," he said. "Not yet. If we run now, they will run us down in the open. We need a shadow they cannot read." He looked toward the hills that rolled like the backs of sleeping bison. In the ravines there were ledges and caves where a person could hide, but reaching them would mean crossing the flat and leaving tracks that told a clear story. He needed a storm or a false trail. He had neither. Late afternoon, a new sound came from the north, iron on wood. He climbed to the loft again and watched a wagon roll slow along the far fence. 2 riders swung beside it. The men did not come to the cabin. They cut across the pasture and headed toward the old line shack he had visited that morning. The scar-faced rider turned his head toward the house once and then rode on. The wagon stopped by the shack and the men began to unload something. He did not like the shape of those bundles. Kerosene tins, stakes, rope. They were building something he had seen before on burned ranches. A trap not for animals but for people. Drive them out of the main house with smoke, then catch them with fire behind and guns ahead. He swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth. Inside, the woman was plaiting her hair back from her face. She saw the set of his jaw and knew. "They will burn," she said. "They will try." He opened the cabinet and pulled out a small tin box he had not touched in years. Inside lay a folded paper and a bit of rag that still held the sharp smell of turpentine. He took the paper and unfolded it. A crude map of his land, drawn by his own hand when he first bought the place. He traced a finger along the creek and the cattail slough that fed it. In spring, the slough was a mess of mud and reeds, but even in winter there were pockets where the ice was thin and the ground treacherous. He began to see a plan that was less a plan than a hope. "We will not stay in the house when dark comes," he said. "We will leave before they set their fire. We will make them think we are inside. We will lead them to the slough and let the land do what it does best. Trick the heavy foot." She studied the map and then the window, learning the ground the way a good hunter does. She pointed to the hay shed. "We hang blanket there, show shape and light." He nodded. "Yes, and we leave a kettle on the stove so they smell heat and believe." Her hands trembled once and then steadied. "We must move fast." They began the quiet work of a hard evening. He cut 2 sticks the length of a person and crossed them, tied with twine, then draped the red blanket so it suggested shoulders. The woman smeared a thin line of goose grease on her cracked fingers and wrapped them in cloth. She did the same for her feet. He stuffed 2 sacks with straw to look like shapes beneath quilts. He left the rifle where he could snatch it as he passed and slipped a short-barreled pistol into his belt. Before dusk, he stepped outside and stared at the ridge. He could feel the men up there like wolves behind brush. He did not hate them. Hate was too simple for a winter like this. He only knew that some men choose to be a hard road for the rest of the world to walk. The world must still walk. The woman touched his sleeve. "I remember a place," she said. "Beyond the slough, a path through rocks where the wind cuts sound. My people used it when soldiers came. It is narrow. 2 cannot ride side by side. That is where we will go." Night rose from the creek bed and filled the yard. The rancher lit the stove and swung the kettle over the ring. Steam began to whisper. He placed the lantern behind the hay shed so the red blanket threw a human shadow. Then he leaned his head toward the woman. "When I open the back door, step where I step, keep low. Do not stop for any sound." She met his eyes and held them steady. "I follow." He pulled the door and they slid into the night. 2 shapes pressed tight to the wall, then to the fence, then to the low drift where the wind had laid a soft ridge. They moved without a word. Their breath came in white bursts and disappeared. Far behind them, the kettle whispered like a living thing. A hiss broke the dark, then a bloom of orange clawed at the line shack. The men had begun. A shout rose, then another, rough voices calling orders that the wind chopped into pieces. Firelight licked the snow and threw long shadows toward the cabin. The rancher and the woman reached the slough and felt the ground change underfoot. He tested each step with his heel before he gave it his weight. She placed her feet in his prints. Behind them, a door splintered. A voice laughed. A second voice cursed. The rancher held the woman's elbow as the reeds brushed their legs. The ice groaned somewhere close. He guided her to the narrow path he remembered, a thread of firmer ground where the cattails bent but did not break. They reached the rocks on the far bank and crouched in the dark seam where 2 slabs met. From there they could see the yard laid out in firelight. Men poured from the hay shed with the red blanket in their hands, swearing at the shape that was not a person. Another kicked at the straw-filled sacks and shouted that the bed was empty. The scar-faced rider stood in the yard and turned his head in a slow circle, searching the black fields, the barn shadow, the creek. He raised his arm, and a handful of men fanned out toward the slough. The rancher felt the woman's breath against his sleeve. She reached for the pouch with the coin and pressed it flat under her palm as if to still its small weight. He knew then that the coin had become more than metal. It had become a test the land had thrown at both of them. How much would they risk to keep it out of the hands that had burned her camp and killed her brother? How much would they risk to keep their own hands clean? The first outlaw stepped onto the slough path and broke through to his knee. He swore and lurched free. The second found the same hole and went to his thigh. The scar-faced rider hissed a warning, and then motioned one of his men away from the slough entirely. That one peeled off and began to circle, careful and slow, angling toward the rocks where the rancher and the woman hid. The rancher drew a long breath and raised the pistol just enough to feel its weight settle. He did not fire, not yet. He listened to the crunch of steps drawing closer and tried to hear which way the night would turn. The wind chose that moment to rise and push smoke from the burning shack across the yard. It rolled low and thick, a gray sheet that swallowed men to the waist and then to the chest. Voices tangled. Horses shrilled. Something knocked over with a crash. The rancher leaned to the woman's ear. "When I say go, you take the rock path and do not stop until the wind cuts sound. I will be behind you." She shook her head once, a small, hard gesture. "We go together." The steps came closer, and the first shadow loomed above the rocks like a tree leaning to fall. The rancher saw the edge of a coat, the shine of frost in a man's beard, the barrel of a gun searching the dark seam where they lay. He squeezed the pistol, felt the roughness of the grips bite his palm, and realized that the night had drawn them into its oldest game. He could feel the moment before a choice like a held breath. He did not know yet which way he would jump. He only knew there was no path back to the simple quiet of the morning. The snow and the fire and the coin and the scar on a stranger's face had braided themselves into a knot he could not cut. The land held still, watching, as the first outlaw's boot scraped the rock and the wind carried sparks across the yard like red bees. The rancher looked once at the woman, and in that look they passed a promise with no words. Then the shadow bent, and everything began to tilt toward the edge. The rancher held his breath as the shadow above the rocks leaned closer. He could see the outline of a man's shoulder, the faint gleam of metal where frost clung to his gun barrel. Every heartbeat sounded too loud in his chest. The Apache woman stayed perfectly still beside him, her breath short and shallow, her fingers clutching the pouch that held the gold coin. The air smelled of smoke, ash, and snow, the scent of the dying fire mixing with the cold wind off the slough. The world had shrunk to that narrow strip of silence between them and the man above. The outlaw took another step, testing the ground. The ice creaked under his boot, the sound sharp and brittle like cracking glass. He stopped, looking down, uncertain. The rancher could see him hesitate, the instinct of a man who had hunted others but never trusted the earth beneath him. Another step slower this time. The rancher's hand tightened on the pistol, his knuckles white. The woman's eyes flicked toward him, a warning or maybe a plea. One wrong move and every man in the yard would come running. A shout broke from behind the barn, sudden and raw. Someone had seen movement near the creek. The man on the rock turned his head, just as the wind carried a burst of sparks from the burning shack. In that instant, the rancher acted. He rose from the shadows, swung the butt of his pistol upward, and struck the man hard across the jaw. The outlaw crumpled soundlessly, his body tumbling down the slope. The rancher grabbed the woman's arm. "Now," he whispered. They moved quickly, half running, half sliding along the narrow path through the rocks. The cold bit at their faces, but they didn't slow. Behind them came voices, angry, confused, searching. The men had discovered the trap, the decoy in the hay shed, and now the hunt was on for real. The night lit up with gunfire, flashes cutting through the smoke like lightning. Bullets hissed past, punching holes in the frozen air. The woman stumbled once, her feet raw and weak, but she didn't fall. The rancher pulled her close, guiding her around boulders slick with ice. The ground began to rise again, leading toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. He knew that if they could reach the timberline, the rocks and trees would give them a fighting chance. Down in the open, they'd be easy targets. They reached a small ravine and ducked behind a fallen tree. The woman gasped for air, clutching her side. "They won't stop," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But neither will we." He looked back through the smoke. The outlaws were spreading out, torches in their hands, their shouts echoing off the frozen land. The scar-faced rider was among them, calm, directing the others with gestures more than words. He wasn't rushing. He was hunting slow, deliberate, confident that he would corner them before dawn. The rancher checked his ammunition. 2 bullets left in the pistol, 6 in the rifle. It wasn't much, but he'd faced worse odds before. He thought of the old freighter's warning, the talk in town, the bounty, the mining man. It wasn't just greed driving these men. Someone powerful had paid them well. As the sounds drew closer, he made a quick decision. "There's a cave past those rocks," he said. "You'll be safer there. Wait till I give a signal, then run." Her head snapped toward him. "You go, I stay," he shook his head. "If they catch you, they'll kill you. If they catch me, maybe I can slow them down." "You saved me once," she said softly. "Now I save you." Before he could argue, she snatched a burning stick that had fallen near the edge of the ravine. The flame caught the wind and flared bright. She held it high, then threw it hard into the snow toward the left, far from their hiding place. The fire hissed, steam rising. The trick worked. Shouts went up as 2 riders turned their horses toward the flicker of light. The distraction gave them a few more moments. The rancher took her hand again and they ran. Their boots sank deep in drifts, their breath coming in clouds. Every sound behind them, every crunch, every echo, felt like it belonged to a man closing in. By the time they reached the cave, dawn was starting to pale the sky. The first thin light touched the edges of the snow, turning it gray. Inside, the cave smelled of damp earth and old smoke. Someone had camped here before. There were charred sticks in a circle and a cracked pot buried in the dirt. The woman sank down, shaking, her face drawn and pale. He knelt beside her and checked her frostbitten hands. The skin was cracked and red, but she didn't flinch. "They know this land," she murmured. "They will find us." He looked toward the mouth of the cave. "Then we'll make it cost them." He moved quietly, gathering what he could. A few stones, some frozen branches, anything that could help. He built a wall of snow and rock just high enough to hide them from sight, but low enough to shoot over if he had to. The woman tore strips of cloth from her blanket and wrapped them around her wrists, then handed him a small piece of bone carved into the shape of an eagle. "For strength," she said. He tucked it into his pocket beside the bracelet she had given him earlier. The small weight of both talismans felt like promises he couldn't break. As the day brightened, the sounds outside changed. The men had regrouped. Horses snorted. Voices barked orders. The scar-faced rider was no fool. He was spreading his men wide, cutting off every escape route. From the mouth of the cave, the rancher could see faint movement through the trees, shadows passing in rhythm. He thought of riding out, drawing their attention away from her. But something in her eyes stopped him. There was no fear in them now, only a quiet fire. She had already lost her people, her brother, everything she owned. Whatever happened next, she wasn't going to run anymore. The sun climbed higher, but brought no warmth. The rancher could feel the cold sinking deep into his bones. His hands had gone stiff, his breath fogging the air. Every few minutes he checked his rifle, listening for the faint click that meant the chamber was ready. He counted the shots in his head, the seconds between shouts, the direction of the wind. Then, a silence fell that was heavier than sound. The kind that comes before something breaks. The horses stopped moving. The wind died completely. Even the crows circling above went still. The rancher leaned forward, peering through the snow. The scar-faced rider had appeared, standing alone in the open field below the ridge. He had no weapon drawn, just that same thin smile cutting across his face. The rancher lifted his rifle but didn't fire. The man raised his hands slightly, a gesture of calm. His voice carried easily across the frozen air. "You got something that don't belong to you," he called. "Give her up and we'll ride away clean." The rancher's voice was low but steady. "You'll ride away sure enough, but not clean." The man laughed, a hollow, cutting sound. "You think she's worth dying for? She's got nothing, just a coin that'll buy her grave." Behind the words, the rancher heard something else, the soft creak of boots shifting in the trees. The others were closing in from both sides. It was a trap within a trap. The scar-faced rider was the bait this time. The woman touched the rancher's arm. "I can end this," she whispered. "If they want me, let them take me. You live." He looked at her, anger flashing in his eyes. "You think I dragged you out of that snow just to hand you back?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but you don't owe me your life." He turned away, watching the tree line. "Out here, we don't measure what we owe. We just do what's right." The snow cracked somewhere to the left, soft, deliberate, the sound of men creeping closer. He could almost feel the crosshairs of their guns lining up. The cave was no longer safe. He pointed toward the ridge. "When I fire, go. Follow the path down the other side. There's a dry creek bed. It'll take you to the woods." She opened, her mouth to argue, but before she could, the sharp crack of a rifle split the air. The bullet struck the rock near his head, spraying chips of stone. The echo rolled across the hills. He fired back, aiming low, forcing the men to scatter. Another shot came, then two more. The sound turned wild and chaotic. Smoke filled the cave as the gunfire echoed through the valley. The rancher ducked behind the snow wall, returning fire in quick bursts. The woman crawled to the far side of the cave, covering her ears, but her eyes never left him. Outside, the scar-faced rider shouted something to his men, but the wind carried it away. A torch flew through the air and landed near the entrance. Flames licked up fast, heat spreading through the cold cave. The smoke thickened, choking them both. The woman coughed, struggling to breathe. The rancher grabbed her hand. "Now," he said. They ran through the back of the cave, where a narrow gap led into the rocks. The fire roared behind them, the air searing their faces. He pushed her ahead, crawling through the tight passage. The snow on the other side blinded him, the world turning white and deafening. Gunshots rang again, closer this time. He pulled her behind a fallen pine and turned back toward the cave. The scar-faced rider had followed them, his silhouette framed by the smoke and fire. Their eyes met across the distance. One man hardened by loss, the other by greed. Between them lay the final stretch of snow, the place where one story would end and another begin. The rancher's rifle was empty now, his hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. But he still stood, watching as the man raised his gun and started toward them through the storm. The woman clutched the pouch against her chest, the gold coin pressing into her skin like a brand. The wind screamed over the ridge, carrying the promise of a final reckoning that neither of them could escape. The rancher took one slow breath, readying himself for whatever came next, as the snow began to fall heavier, swallowing the shapes of men and fire alike. Snow fell thick and fast, covering everything in white silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. The rancher stood half hidden behind the fallen pine, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of a man who had given everything to the fight. The scar-faced rider came forward through the storm, boots crunching in the snow, gun steady in his hand. Behind him, the flames from the cave were dying, curling into black smoke that drifted up into the gray sky. The rancher knew he had one shot left, the pistol tucked into his coat. His fingers felt stiff and numb, but his mind was clear. He waited until the outlaw drew closer, close enough that he could see the faint curl of his breath in the cold air. The man grinned as if he already owned the moment. "You should have walked away, rancher," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "Maybe," the rancher replied softly. "But a man who walks away from what's right don't deserve the land he stands on." The scar-faced rider raised his gun, but before he could fire, the woman moved. She stepped out from behind the pine, snow whipping around her, the small pouch of gold still clutched in her hands. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the wind. "You want this? Take it." The outlaw's eyes flicked toward her, greedy and sharp. That single glance was enough. The rancher drew the pistol and fired. The shot cracked through the still air, echoing across the ridge. The outlaw staggered, surprise frozen on his face. He dropped to his knees, the snow beneath him blooming red. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the far-off hiss of fire dying out. The woman stared at the fallen man, then turned toward the rancher. He lowered the pistol, his arm heavy. "It's over," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "For now." They stood in silence as the storm began to settle. Around them, the tracks of the outlaws faded under the falling snow. Whatever men had followed the scar-faced rider were gone, or had fled into the hills. The land, always hungry for secrets, was already swallowing the traces of what had happened. By the time they made their way back to the cabin, dawn had broken again. The fire in the hearth was long dead, and the air inside was cold enough to sting. The rancher set down his rifle, then helped the woman to a chair near the hearth. He poured what was left of the water into the kettle and set it to warm. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the quiet that comes after survival, when words feel too small for what has been endured. She looked at him, her eyes soft but tired. "You saved me twice," she said. He shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I just stood close enough to help." Her lips curved faintly. "Then we both lived because we didn't run." He nodded. The storm had cleared his thoughts as much as it had cleared the sky. Out there, in the fight, he'd felt something awaken, a piece of the man he used to be before loneliness and loss had made him quiet. He had lived through too many winters thinking the world had already taken everything worth keeping. But now, looking at her, he realized he still had something left to protect. They buried the bodies at the edge of the creek that afternoon. The ground was frozen hard, so it took hours, but the rancher worked without complaint. The woman stood beside him, her face unreadable. When it was done, she dropped the small gold coin into the shallow grave. "Let it stay with them," she said. "No more blood for this." He covered the grave with snow and nodded. "The land will remember." That evening, they sat together by the fire. The warmth felt different now, earned, not borrowed. The woman's hands were still bandaged, her skin marked by frost and flame, but she looked stronger. She spoke softly, telling him pieces of her story between the crackle of the wood. Her tribe had once lived in the valleys near the Red Cliffs. Her brother had been a scout, her mother a healer. When the soldiers came, they lost everything. The coin had been found years later, a token from a broken promise, a treaty payment that never reached her people. It was never about the gold itself, but what it represented. The rancher listened, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Then maybe that coin did some good after all," he said finally. "It brought you here." She looked at him for a long time before answering. "And it brought you back to yourself." Days passed and the snow began to soften. The land started to breathe again. Birds returned to the trees and the cattle, once lost in the storm, wandered back toward the fences. The rancher rebuilt what the fire had damaged, the barn wall, the gate, the broken shutters. The woman helped as much as she could, her movements careful but steady. She laughed once while trying to hammer a loose board, and he realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh at all. It was a quiet sound, almost shy, but it filled the space between them in a way that made the world seem wider again. By spring, the valley had changed. The snow melted into streams that fed the grasslands, and the earth turned green. The woman had healed enough to walk long distances, and one morning she told him she wanted to return to her people. "They think I'm gone," she said. "I must show them I am not." He stood beside her, his hat low over his brow. "You'll always have a place here," he said quietly. She smiled, a small but honest smile. "And you will always have a fire that remembers me." He saddled one of his calmer horses for her and filled a leather pouch with food and water. Before she left, she reached into her bag and took out something small, a carved pendant shaped like the eagle she'd once given him. She tied it to his wrist with a piece of rawhide. "For luck," she said again. He watched as she rode toward the horizon, the rising sun painting the land gold. The sky stretched endless, and for the first time in years, it felt like a promise instead of a burden. Weeks passed, and though the rancher went about his work as before, the quiet around the cabin had changed. He often found himself glancing toward the hills where the trail disappeared. At night, when the fire burned low, he would hold the small pendant in his hand and think of her voice, her courage, the way she had faced the cold with nothing but strength. One morning, as he rode out to mend a fence, he saw something glinting in the creek bed. Dismounting, he picked it up. It was another coin half buried in mud, the same design as the one she had dropped into the grave. He turned it over in his palm, then smiled faintly and slipped it into his coat pocket beside the bracelet she had woven. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and wild sage. The land stretched quiet and alive around him, scarred yet beautiful, like the people who had survived upon it. He realized then that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about finding meaning in what remained. That night, as the storm clouds gathered in the distance, he lit a single lantern and hung it in the window. Maybe it was habit or maybe it was hope. Somewhere out there he believed she would see it, an old rancher's fire burning against the night. A promise kept between two souls who had met by chance in the dead of winter. The snow began to fall again, soft and slow. The rancher sat by the hearth, his rifle leaned against the wall, his hands resting on his knees. He closed his eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, the hiss of wood, the whisper of wind, the steady crackle of life refusing to fade. The firelight flickered over his face, warm and steady, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts finally laid to rest. Outside, the land was silent and vast, stretching far into the unseen, and in that silence beneath the falling snow, the story of the Apache woman and the rancher became part of the land itself, a quiet legend carried by the wind across the prairies, whispered in the language of survival, courage, and the strange mercy of a shared fire on a frozen night.